So this is a perfect scene for foam. This is exactly the sort of thing it was designed for. Foam, of course, makes realistic bubbles that behave as bubbles really behave in a liquid environment. Bubbles that stick together, bubbles that pop, bubbles that cluster, bubbles of various sizes. It's a great particle system for that, although, of course, it's also just a good all-purpose particle system for other things as well. So let's select our foam layer, turn it on, and you'll see we have a white solid, just a white solid. That's a great place to start with foam, because foam, like radio waves, obliterates the layer that you apply it to, so you need to apply it to a solid. Let me hit the home key to jump back to frame 0, and we'll go up to Effect, Simulation, and choose Foam. And if we tap the space bar, you'll see right out of the gate some nice little blue foam bubbles come pouring out of this little red area in the center of the screen. There's actually some artifacting around the top edge of the screen as well. But really what we're looking at here, very similar to some other plugins that we've seen in this program, is Draft View. This is a setup view. Although I have to say with foam, it's much less necessary to work with the draft view than the rendered view, because the rendered view is plenty darn fast. So let's switch from draft over to rendered and look at foam in all of its glory. And you can see that just with its default settings, foam automatically produces some pretty cool results. We definitely have what looks like bubbles moving around on screen. Pretty cool. But of course, if all we did was apply filters and use the default settings, we wouldn't need training, would we? So let's take a look at some of the controls that allow us to get the most out of foam in After Effects. First of all, the producer point is where the bubbles come from. The location of it is easy enough to understand, the same little plus sign that we get for every other producer point in After Effects, and you can click and drag that around if you like. Every time we drag this, you'll see the bubbles are going crazy. That's because this is a true simulation system, and by adjusting the origin point for the bubbles, we are actually adjusting all of the bubbles up to that point in the simulation. We're not animating this point, so it's producing entirely different results at 4 seconds into the animation just by dragging it around. But we can also adjust the producer's size horizontally and vertically. That's what X and Y mean. And the orientation of the producer. We'll switch really quickly back over to draft mode so you can see the producer size is represented by the red oval that you see on screen. So a much wider X size gives us predictable results. A much taller Y size also gives us predictable results. And if we have ourselves an oblong producer like this, adjusting the producer orientation will rotate the producer. So you have a lot of control over the shape of the area that's actually going to be emitting the particles, which is very important. Let's set those back to their defaults. Let me just hit undo a few times and get us back to a nice small producer setting. The production rate essentially controls the number of bubbles that we see on screen. And zoom producer point, which is set on by default, has to do with how the producer point corresponds with flow maps should you choose to zoom in and out of flow maps. And we'll be taking a look at flow maps in just a second. Let me close down our producer points. Now let's actually talk about the bubbles themselves. The bubble size controls the maximum size of the bubble during its lifetime. But as you can see on screen, there's all sorts of different size bubbles. That's because there's some randomness built into this simulation. And that randomness is controlled by the size variance adjustment. So a size value of 0.5 and a variance of 0.5 means that we can have bubbles anywhere from 0 up to 1, because the variance allows a bubble size to vary both in a positive and a negative direction. Set this variance value down to 0, and all the bubbles that we see on screen will be of a uniform size, and that size is determined by the first slider that we see here. So we'll set those back to close to their default values. There we go. Set this back down to 0.5. Wonderful. Now, lifespan has to do with how long a bubble stays on screen before it pops. If we set this to a much lower value, like, say, 10, and hit enter, you're not going to see many bubbles on screen at all, because in 10 frames, the bubbles are just going to pop. So you're seeing we're creating bubbles, but they only live for 10 frames, and then they disappear. Crank that value up, and the higher we crank it, the longer the bubbles can potentially live. Now, the lifespan value only sets a potential value. There's still some randomness involved in exactly when a bubble pops. Otherwise, you'd have this very predictable cutoff line and you wouldn't get a realistic bubble effect like what we see here. That randomness is set by the strength slider. The stronger a bubble is, the less likely it's going to pop until it reaches its maximum lifespan. So cranking up strength typically will make all bubbles bust in a more predictable fashion. Cranking down strength will make bubbles more fragile and more likely to pop when they come into contact with other bubbles. Okay? And the bubble growth speed has to do with how quickly a bubble gets from its birth size of 0 up to its maximum life size. So crank that value down. Let's add the control key to fine-tune this. And the bubbles will take much longer to get to their full size. Crank our lifespan back up again so we have more bubbles on screen. So that's how the bubble controls themselves work. Let's reset the filter so that we're back to more default settings and drag our producer back up where we can see it clearly against the bathtub background. The next set of controls has to do with the physical behavior of the bubbles. That includes the initial speed, that's how fast they're moving in this direction, set by the initial direction slider. So if we crank this over to the right and set the initial speed value up really high, you'll see that the bubbles are actually being sent off to the right instead of just emerging from a central producer point. I'll undo those. And once a bubble is born onto the surface of the imaginary liquid on which it lives, wind speed takes over, and the wind speed blows it in a direction determined by this slider. So wind speed and wind direction are sort of analogous to gravity in a simulation like Shatter. Crank the wind speed up, and the bubbles, after they're born, will be blown in the direction set by the wind direction slider here. Of course, these two will work together. So if we crank our initial direction off to the right again and our initial speed off to the right again, you'll see that as the bubbles are born, they now blow off right, and then the wind pulls them down. So the two work together. Turbulence controls the amount of randomness in the simulation, makes the bubbles bounce around a lot more. Wobble amount will actually distort the bubbles into a kind of a bean shape and then sort of spin them around as they go. This can actually create very realistic bubble effects. In fact, let me reset things again so that we're just dealing with bubbles. And we'll crank that wobble amount up again, and you'll see that the shapes of the bubbles get distorted the higher the wobble amount goes, and the bubbles themselves twirl around. If we set our mode back to rendered, you'll see the results of that. In certain situations, a little bit of wobble can add a lot of realism to the scene, but a value this extreme just looks artificial. You'll see a little bit of it can add some bubble dynamics to the simulation. Repulsion has to do with how likely bubbles are to push other bubbles out of the way. And this is very important. Bubbles don't want to occupy the same space as other bubbles. So as you see the simulation going on here, you'll see bubbles bouncing into other bubbles and knocking them out of the way. That's because repulsion, by default, is set to its maximum. If we crank that value down, the bubbles no longer interact with each other at all at a value of 0 and behave much more like a traditional particle system where particles are just born and then taken over by the physics of the system, otherwise ignoring the other particles that occupy the same screen with them. This can be very useful for certain particle animations, but not necessarily for realistic bubbles. So let's turn repulsion back up again. Pop velocity. You remember a little bit ago we talked about bubbles having a lifespan. At the end of that lifespan, bubbles are liable to pop. Pop velocity determines how likely the popping of a single bubble will trigger the explosion of other nearby bubbles. So when you're creating a really realistic bubble simulation, adjusting up the pop velocity can create these pockets of cascading bubble explosions that are very, very realistic. Now the last couple of things, viscosity controls how far bubbles go once they're born. You see we crank viscosity up, and just like in Shatter, the viscosity makes the particles travel less far. We're starting to get something looking really realistic now. Drag that down onto our drain there, and you'll see we're getting some more realistic behavior here. And stickiness has to do with how likely bubbles are to clump together. So the higher the stickiness value, the more liable bubbles are to kind of glue themselves to each other and stick to each other and behave like realistic foam. So we're definitely getting something that looks a little more realistic here. Let me adjust my wind direction to this direction. So now the bubbles are sort of moving up the bathtub as they're born, and we're getting some really great results here. Let's move on to the next important section, and that's the rendering section. This controls how the bubbles are rendered together. Transparent just sort of blends all the bubbles together in a predictable fashion. Old on top means that new bubbles will be born underneath other bubbles, and new on top means new bubbles will be born on top of other bubbles. This is very, very difficult to see in the default bubble settings because they all have this kind of gentle transparency to them. So these are some things that you can experiment with should you choose to use custom bubbles, which we'll be talking about in just a second. The bubble texture, this is the default bubble. You have a bunch of other bubble textures to choose from in here. Water beads, spit, which basically is just a white circle, cartoon coffee, winter stream. All of them have their uses. Most of these were designed for specific tasks. But of course, in addition to the built-in bubbles, you can use custom bubbles by choosing user-defined. Again, we'll look at that in just a second. The bubble texture layer relates to the user-defined settings, and bubble orientation is also best explained with a custom setting, so we'll get to that in just a sec. As for environmental map, that allows us to create a reflection map that reflects into our bubbles. So if, for example, we chose our bathtub and cranked up the reflection strength, the color of the bubbles would start to pick up a little bit of their environment as they flow over the environment, add a little bit more realism to the scene, and the reflection convergence setting allows you to fine-tune just how much the bubbles distort the surface that they're moving over. This can actually be very, very useful when you're creating water beads running down the surface of a soda bottle, for example. And that brings us to the topic of flow maps. Now, a flow map is a way that you can use the luminance of another layer to control where bubbles go on screen, and this is one of the features that makes foam such a powerful particle system. If, for example, we turn off our bathtub image and turn on the flow map image, you'll see we have a black layer with this kind of white mountain in it. And the white mountain has a feathered edge and a very sharp point. Now, a flow map in foam is just like a terrain map that we would use for displacement, for example, in Wave World. One limitation in foam is that a flow map has to be a still. So if you try to feed foam a moving flow map, it's not going to work. It's only going to use the first frame of the flow map. But here we have this still. If we set up our producers so that we are producing the bubbles just above this point, and if we set up the physics so that our wind direction is making the bubbles flow south towards the point, and crank up our wind speed so that they flow a little bit faster, and then go to our flow map settings and choose the flow map that we brought in here, the one marked basic. If we choose that as a flow map, watch what happens. The flow map actually controls where the bubbles go on screen. Here's what's going on. The wind is actually blowing the bubbles this way, but the flow map itself is acting as a hill that's in the way of the bubbles' progress down the path. Bubbles always want to flow downhill. They always want to flow downwind. So if you think of the light-colored areas as the high portions of the map and the dark-colored areas as the low portions of the map, you'll see how this works. Now, an area of absolute black or absolute white has no slope whatsoever, so it's just read as flat and ignored by foam. It's only areas of pixels where change occurs that's interpreted as a slope. So the fact that we have blurring going on down here at this portion in the map, this enables foam to interpret these areas as a slope and actually make the bubbles flow around it, which is really, really cool. But working with flow maps can be kind of tricky. If we take a look at this other layer in here marked flow map, you can see a fairly common mistake. Let's say we want to use this flow map to actually control where the bubbles pass through our swisho scene here. In essence, this map is upside down, A, and B, it needs to be blurred because foam has no ability to distinguish a transition this subtle. It will simply flow right over this because it's going to interpret the white area as flat and the black area as flat. And because there's no gray transitional area here, it's not going to be interpreted as a slope at all. So we need to blur this layer and we need to invert it because white is high, black is low. So we got to turn this upside down essentially. So let's pre-compose this layer and fix it. Control-Shift-C, that's Command-Shift-C on the Mac, allows us to pre-compose. We're going to move all attributes into the new composition. We'll just accept flowmap.ai comp1 as the comp name. And let's hold down the Alt key on Windows, Option on Mac, and take a look at that composition. We'll select the layer that we want to work with here. Go apply Effect, Channel, Invert, and that, of course, will invert our image perfectly. And then we want to apply Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur. We like Fast Blur because it has this Repeat Edge Pixels feature. We turn that on and blur our image, and that'll give us a nice blurry map to try to route our bubbles through, okay? If I didn't have Repeat Edge Pixels turned on, you'd see we get this black trough kind of running around the edges of our map as well, and we don't want that. So we'll turn Repeat Edge Pixels on, and now we've properly prepared our pre-composition. Let's go back into our foam intro and see how we can use this flow map to control our bubbles. I'm going to turn off its visibility because we don't need to see it, and get rid of our other flow map as well, and turn on our bathtub so we can see where it is that we want to flow. Let me select the foam layer, hit F3 to bring back up foam, and say as a flow map, let's use the flowmap.ai comp1 that we just generated. Now I have an option here under my view to choose draft plus flow map, and this will allow me to precisely position my bubbles inside the flow map, which is great. This allows me to set things up really nicely. So let me take my physics and take my wind speed, I don't know, to around 1, and we'll set the wind direction so that it's blowing this way. That'll make the bubbles inclined to head in this direction, then hopefully the flow map will carry them along through this pathway. We can also turn down our repulsion value just a bit because otherwise bubbles are going to kind of clump up here in the middle, I think. Let's see what kind of behavior we get by default. So here the bubbles are born, and sure enough, they're flowing along the pathway that we've set for them. That's great. They're just not moving fast enough. So let's crank our wind value up. That's pretty good. Now we know that after the bubbles are born, the wind takes over, and they flow swishy right along our path there. So that's great. Let's turn on rendered, and we'll see that, oops, our bubbles aren't quite appearing where we want them to. We want them to appear right here where this plumbing detail is occurring. So let me drag those over, and it looks like we're fortunate enough that we're still inside our flow map, so that's okay. And you could experiment with other bubble colors if you like, but I'm just going to keep these for now. We'll turn on our Swisho logo, and you'll see we've generated a pretty fun little animation where the superior cleaning power of Swisho shows us that bubbles will happily emerge from your drain and move in a pathway across your bathtub or something. So those are the basics of foam. It's pretty much how it works. It's a pretty easy particle system to work with, although it has an enormous amount of control. But what we haven't really gotten into yet is one of the most powerful aspects of foam, and that's the ability to use custom particles to create custom particle systems. Let's close down this composition and open up our second one, the custom particles composition. And let's take a look at some of the layers that we have here. We, of course, have our fire blur background. It's this pretty background that we've seen once or twice, and, of course, in the opening to this series. We also have a couple of compositions. We have a composition that simply has a puff ball, which is a white ball with transparent edges. We also have a star comp, which is a composition that looks like this, little twinkly stars just generated with masks inside After Effects. And we have a few other details down at the bottom that we'll talk about in just a second. For now, let's select our Stardust layer, turn it on, and we'll apply foam and see how we can create a couple of cool custom particle effects. So let's go apply Effect, Simulation, Foam. So move our effect window up where we can work with it. And jump back to frame 0. Twirl open our producer. I'm going to hit the comma key to zoom out just one click so that we can quickly set a keyframe for our producer point and drag it off screen. Jump down to about 1 second. Bring our producer point here. Jump over to about 2 seconds. Bring our producer point up here. Jump over to about 3 seconds. Drag it off screen. So now we've essentially created a moving particle system that swishes through the scene here. Can't see that very well at that resolution, so let's zoom back in. You'll see our traditional draft rendering, which we don't need, of course, because foam is plenty fast enough to render at full quality. Let's set that to rendered. And under our rendering mode, let's choose as a bubble texture, user-defined, and as our user-defined texture, let's choose the star comp. Now if we hit the space bar, you'll see those lovely little star particles, just like fairy dust, are moving across the screen. Very cool, very pretty. If we wanted to adjust the size, of course, we go up to our bubble settings and crank up the size. Now we have bigger bits of dust. A highly recommended thing for this sort of animation is to turn repulsion all the way down. That way things will behave much more like a normal particle system, where the particles don't bump each other out of the way. Now while we have a few of these stars on screen, let's discuss one of the other settings that we bypassed earlier, and that's the bubble orientation, which, when set to fixed, keeps everything up and down. But if we choose physical orientation, it means the bubbles will rotate slightly, and if we turned our repulsion back up a little bit, you'd see they'd start going every which way. What's going on basically is the bubbles themselves bounce off other bubbles and start having a little bit of spin, a little bit of wobble, and the orientation can change quite a bit. We're not seeing a lot of those results here with this example, but if you experiment, you'll see what I mean. Also, bubble velocity can determine the orientation of the bubbles, meaning the bubbles will always orient themselves along the direction that they're moving. And I'll show you a really great use for that in just a second. So this is a nice little stardust animation, little stardust particles moving across the screen. That's great. Now that we've done that, we might want to add a little dust to the simulation. So let me duplicate our layer here. Everything gets very much brighter for just a second. And in the copy that I made, let me bring up its effects window. And under rendering, I'm going to choose a different map. Let's choose the puff comp instead. So, we got these sort of poofy cloud things. Now these are much too large, so let's go back to our bubble size and crank that down. So that's given us some smaller particles to mix in with our stardust. And if we wanted to, we could adjust the random seed somewhat, which will change our results so that we don't use exactly the same calculations on multiple copies of the effect. And now let me generate a quick preview of that, and we'll see what it looks like. And the results in this case certainly look pretty cool. Now there's some wiggling going on in the actual particles themselves that in this case doesn't look appropriate. And that's because we have the orientation set to bubble velocity. If we switch that back to fixed for both the puffball and for our original stardust layer, you'll see that that little bit of twitching goes away. And what we've come up with here is a nice little sort of pixie dust style animation. Foam is really great for this sort of stuff if you're willing to use custom particles. But another really cool thing it can do with custom particles is actually orient them along the path that they're created. So let me close this window down, and I'm going to turn off our stardust layers here that we've been working with. At the very bottom here, you'll see an ant composition, and if I double-click on that and drag it down where you can see it, and actually expand our window so we can just look at the alpha channel, what we have in here is an animated mask in a pre-comp, and if I hit the space bar, you'll see that the animated mask is a little walking ant. Just a little ant wiggling his legs in a seamless loop. Use this ant as a custom particle in foam. Turn repulsion up to 100% if it isn't already, and tell the bubble particles to orient themselves along their velocity path, and what you'll get in this case is a swarm of fairly realistic ants that emerge out of the center hole in the screen, jostle each other out of the way. No ant walks on top of any other ant, at least once they're born and are firmly on screen. And the results are just really kind of creepy and fairly realistic here. Let me turn on the bevel alpha as well to give them some more dimension and a little bit of drop shadow. Let's RAM preview this and see what we've got. And the results, if we generate a quick RAM preview, have been known to cause queasiness in certain individuals who have a bug phobia. But between you and me, I think this looks pretty realistic. This is actually one of my favorite effects. And it's done with a plug-in designed basically to generate realistic spit for toothpaste commercials. So obviously, like many of the other effects I've shown you in this last program, foam is capable of going far beyond the original design spec. It's a very, very capable plug-in for general particle systems and general particle work. And any time that you need to create little sparklies or little fairy dust or even smoke or even crawling ants, foam is a great animation solution.